Hello, welcome to my presentation today, which is entitled Non-Fugitive Emissions Tracking Technology, and is presented as part of the 2022 CarbonExpo virtual event. I'm Larry Brazile. I'm president of SmartLift, and I'm excited to be here today. SmartLift has a product named Avenirre, which was designed to help producers increase their profitability, but it also helps reduce their emissions. So that's going to be the subject of my talk today. So I'm going to share my screen, show you a few slides, and I trust that they'll be able to help you and your company be even more successful. All right. Avenirre was formed 4 years ago by seasoned professionals, shall we say. We create a business intelligence platform to not only graphically display your production, lease operating expenses and reserves, and add operational visibility to your entire team. But we've also added emissions inventory and analysis to the same platform, which is what I want to visit with you about today. Avenirre can help you identify, track, and reduce your non-fugitive emissions. So kind of an overview, the oil and gas industry delivers essential fuel and products to the world, but it creates emissions in the process. Regulatory actions and remote monitoring of emissions are increasing in activity and sensitivity. Here's how calculations made from an inventory of your emitting devices can be used to document and economically prioritize your mitigation efforts. So in this video, I want to do three things. I want to start with the basics. I want to discuss how emissions can result from what are our historically normal production practices. I want to show you what tools are available. Secondly, I'm going to introduce you to a software solution that helps you track emissions and create a mitigation schedule that uses economics to guide your efforts. And finally, I want to talk about how to get started in your organization. First, a couple of definitions. Greenhouse gas emissions are those gases such as methane or CO2 or others, which have been judged to have an impact on the climate. Different gases have different impacts on the climate. Fugitive emissions are those unplanned, accidental, or irregular releases of gas from a pressurized container. That's the definition. By nature, those emissions are very difficult to predict or control. But closer to the subject today are non-fugitive emissions, definition of those, which are the planned and purposeful releases of gas from devices such as natural gas-driven liquid level controllers or uncaptured tank vapors from hydrocarbon storage tanks. So that is the problem that I want to talk about today. So the historical production practices go back to the very beginnings of the energy industry, because natural gas has been historically a very low value commodity, and in the very beginnings of our industry, it was almost more of a nuisance and a waste product than an actual asset. So these low gas prices and low awareness of greenhouse emissions led to the development of pneumatic devices that intentionally release methane to the atmosphere during normal operation. We've talked about some examples of those devices. Here's some more. The separator float controls and pressure operated control valves. All of those kinds of things exist on our locations. But then in addition, there are some point sources of emissions that are such as when we vent gas wells to the atmosphere to remove accumulated liquids so that we can continue producing, or vapors that get flashed from liquid hydrocarbon storage tanks. Those things have existed historically in our industry and continue to exist. So I want to show you, this is just kind of a diagrammatic cartoon of some devices on a location that emit hydrocarbons as a function of normal operation. So you can have chemical tanks, chemical injection quantities on location. You can have a latch valve or a control valve, which is seen there in red. You can have liquid level controllers, which use natural gas pressure to actuate and remove the liquids from the separators. You can blow down the wells to unload fluid, but you throw that to either the atmosphere and the liquids to a flash tank. But then there's tank breathing itself, just over a normal course of temperature and pressure fluctuations in the atmosphere could cause tanks to offload gases to the atmosphere. So we have all these things on our location, but what's different today? Well, what's different is that there is an increased awareness of natural gas, greenhouse effects, and gas prices at least as of March in 2022 here are in the range of $4 an MCF. So gas is now valuable. So I've got a paper on our website if you would like to explore this particular subject further. And it talks about how plunger lift can reduce the need for atmospheric blowdowns. And it's available at Avenirre.com if you would like to read that later. So you may be wondering, how can anyone discover methane releases from my specific location, which maybe is located in the middle of nowhere? The answer is yes, they can. And very soon they're going to have incredible accuracy down to 100 meters square. 100 meters is roughly the length of a football field, and they can measure the densities down to 2 parts per billion, they claim. We'll see. But the very newest satellites are going to zero in on everyone's locations, no matter where it is on the Earth, and roughly every 7 days as it orbits over it. And that information is going to be available to the general public. So the sensing capabilities are increasing in capabilities and sensitivities. There's a satellite going to go up. It's projected to launch in October of this year. It's been built by the Environmental Defense Fund. Name of it is Methane Sat. And they've already got their contract with SpaceX as their launch vehicle, and we'll see, but it looks like it's going to happen. So just be aware of that. So how to get started reducing non-fugitive emissions? It's extremely hard to reduce anything if you don't measure it. So step one is just simply to create an inventory of your devices on your location, and then use known engineering formulas to calculate the volumes being emitted. Each device on location emits gases as a function of something, a function of pressure, a function of production going through a separator, whatever that number is, and then there are known engineering formulas that you can use to calculate that. So I prefer that solution as opposed to other solutions, such as like a FLIR camera, or maybe just a vapor sensor on location, because those kinds of devices are subject to calibration issues or maybe wind speed and direction issues at the moment in time. So, my thinking is that let's just calculate what our emissions are, and then second step is to calculate the value of those emissions. Now, what I mean by that is like, the gas that's being vented has an economic value these days, and so using your realized natural gas prices at that location, counting transportation and all the ways that we do to calculate the value of gas. In the software that Avenirre has, we use the most recently available daily NYMEX gas closing prices from the recent market, whatever the most recent daily market close is, and use that price subject to the deductions that historically apply to your lease. And then third step is to begin to mitigate. In other words, create an internal report by location, which you can sort by any way you choose to, but if you choose sort from highest to lowest on the annual revenue loss, that will help you zero in on a starting place for your mitigation efforts. You may find that you can increase revenue and economically mitigate some of those emissions for a small capital expenditure that will actually give you a good return on your investment, because selling that gas will increase your revenue. So, I'll say let's just start with the easy economic opportunities and then go from there. So what's our solution? Avenirre has a dashboard that does the calculation and report generation work for you. So here's an example of the emissions dashboard in Avenirre. So this graph chart is it's a combination of 107 wells, and it's over a 3-month period, and you see the fluctuations in the emissions rate. Some of those are associated with equipment upsets and different things. But you can if you look at it for a moment, you can see a downward trend, which says that the operator is working on his emissions or his production is decreasing. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But the table on the left-hand side over here, it displays the emissions in daily, month to date, and year to date in terms of MCF. And this row calculates the same numbers in terms of metric tons of natural gas. And then finally, the bottom row there calculates the same emissions in terms of the metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Okay, so that requires a little bit of explanation. So the software does all the math for you, but the various environmental agencies around the world have tried to balance and figure out a way to score the environmental impact of emissions that result from different types of gases versus each other in order to provide a common yardstick for evaluating the impact. For example, methane has a much greater environmental impact than does CO2, although methane doesn't last as long in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a very stable molecule. So these agencies scored each gas with a ratio number compared to CO2. It can either be higher or lower. Methane happens to be much higher than CO2. So for a given type and volume of gas emitted, we calculate the impact as if it was equivalent to a given volume of CO2. So that's the normal way gases are scored out in the reporting part. And the math can be easily done for you, and so that you can concentrate your efforts on mitigating those rather than doing the math. So while we're on this page, another metric that I see from time to time is a calculation of emission intensity, which is your emissions of CO2 equivalent per unit of production. I think that this emission intensity metric was created to respond to a question that might arise. Let's say if your production is declining and your CO2 equivalent emissions are also declining. So are you actually improving your emissions, or are you just reducing your emissions coincidentally because your production is also declining? So it's very easy to calculate this metric once you have your CO2 equivalent number. You just take that number and then divide by your production. So it's the same calculation, whether you do it on an individual lease basis or a total company basis. It just gives you this the amount of CO2 that you're emitting per unit of production, and it's it's pretty good. It's a pretty good metric to have, and it's an interesting idea. And I'm starting to see it more and more. So here's the second page of the emissions report in Avenirre, and this is an example of a tabular report by well, which you can easily sort by any column in this report. This report happens to be sorted by the estimated annual net revenue loss from fugitive emissions. The very top well there it seems economic to put some mitigation efforts toward it, but you can see that it's emitted a fair amount of revenue in that particular year. For a year, it's estimated based on the rate of revenue over a given time period. And so that's something you may want to focus your efforts on, that operator. But I also want to point out, and it's kind of hard to see maybe, but right here in the lower left-hand column on the corner is export controls. You can export this report as, and actually any report as a CSV file or a PDF, and you can preserve that document then for your reporting and uses and needs that you may have. I get it. It's often helpful to read case studies that have more details on the process that I just discussed. And so we have a paper on our website that's available if you'd like to grab it and read it and talk about how you calculate oil and gas emissions and the associated revenue loss that is associated with those emissions. So closing remarks. What I need to do next? Our industry has a problem. This is planned and unplanned fugitive emissions of natural gas. We have to recognize that the situation that we live in today is different than it used to be. We have to recognize that our industry is being called to a higher standard. I know change is hard, but change we must. And as individuals and companies, we are responsible and held accountable for many things, and emissions are one of those things. So solutions are available, and we would love to be a small part of your success. Thank you so much for your time and viewing this video and for your participation in this year's CarbonExpo. And I look forward to visiting with you in the future.